So if you want the slides, they're entirely here. Okay, so I'll start now, but feel free to use this. Okay, so I have a strange setup with Zoom. So let's see. So you can see this, I think.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, this is an MBR working paper. It's with Jose Barrera at ITAM and Steve Davis at Chicago. It's called Why Working from Home Will Stick. I'm kind of doing updated version of the MBR, an extended version of the MBR working paper. So there's basically, as backdrop, been a huge increase in working from home. We are roughly about 10 times above where we were pre-COVID. So there's a lot of different ways to measure working from home. My favorite is probably percentage of paid full days work from home. So loads of people, everyone probably works from home, mornings, evenings, etc. What we care about is full paid days. This affects commute and affects office space. And before the pandemic, this is US data. I'm guessing Brazil will probably be half these levels throughout. UK, for example, is very similar. You know, Brazil, the pattern's going to look similar, just the levels will be lower. But before the pandemic, very low levels, even in the US, of working from home. So 5% of working days, paid days, were fully at home, 95% on the business premises. During the pandemic, they went up about 10 times, so around 50%. And then the question is, what's happening post-pandemic? Well, we are running a survey of 5,000 Americans per month and reweighted them. I'll come into details a bit using the current CPS, current population survey weights, to represent the whole US. We asked them, what has your employer told you your working pattern is going to be post-pandemic? I also surveyed around 500 firms a month and asked them what they've told their employees. And I've also been talking to a lot of companies doing, you know, to be honest, bits of consulting and presentations about working from home. I've been working on working from home for like 20 years. No one really cared much about it until March 2020, then it exploded. So this data point I feel pretty confident about. This data point says post-pandemic, about 1/4 of days in the US, roughly paid days, 20–25% will be work from home. The rest will be on the business premises. You know, it looks like as months and months go on, this thing's becoming more and more entrenched. Here is another measure, which is the average days employees want to work from home. Sorry, employers say they're going to have people work from home. So we asked people, what has your firm told you? And this is the average. So at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, look, my firm has told me I'm going to get to work from home on average 1 day a week. And this has been climbing up and up and up. So not only is working from home looking like it's going to stay, but as the pandemic grinds on, it's become more and more popular and it's become more and more entrenched. And it really very clearly looks like it's here, you know, in the long run. To be clear, and I'll come back to this later, what's going to be here in the long run is hybrid. So for Naercio or me, or most people listening, professionals, managers, post-pandemic, by far the most common pattern is we'll work in the office, say 3 days a week, and work from home 2 days a week. And company like Stanford's doing this for the staff, for the most faculty, you know, the World Bank, the UN, most companies. I'll show you lots of examples, but hybrid has become dominant. Right now, many people are full-time working from home, but post-pandemic, it's hybrid. And the other thing is becoming a huge issue in the US is for the labor market. You probably heard in the news about what's called the Great Resignation. So quit rates have been rising. They're pretty high. In fact, the JOLTS data on quits was out today. It's slightly down, but it's still very high. It's almost about 3% of Americans are quitting per month. One reason they're quitting is because they want to work from home job. So here is in our survey, here's people that have quit in the last 6 months. We survey 5,000 people a month. We ask them if they have quit, why did you quit? Give up to 3 reasons. And here's folks with less than a 4-year college degree. So this is lower skilled and this is higher skilled. You can see in both groups, particularly the higher skilled, increasing their ability to work from home is a big issue. So what's going on in North America is we've had a pandemic-induced shift to work from home. Roughly half of people are doing that full time. Now, as the pandemic is, you know, slowly, although very slowly with Omicron, slowly ending, people are starting to drift back into hybrid. So work from home, let's say 2 days a week. That's being pushed by people enjoying it and by the fact that employers know if they don't offer their employees some ability to work from home, they face people quitting and finding jobs that do. So I don't know if people heard in the news, but Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan in March and April 2021 said, you know, we're bankers. Everyone has to be in the office. You've all got to come back 5 days a week. They've basically given up because of this. It turns out when Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan tried to get everyone back in the office 5 days a week, so many of their employees said, well, quit if you make us do it, because Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, etc., let us work from home. We just moved to them, that they gave up. So what I'm going to do today is I argue working from home here is to stay. So why it's a permanent change, explain why it's here to stay, and then talk about implications. The third thing is a massively open research area. The shift to work from home is a huge impact of the pandemic, and it's going to affect, economics, politics, society for, years, maybe even decades to come. And so I think it's a really interesting, really open research area. I'm going to show you some very quick facts on a few things, but, this is no more than preliminary data, and there's lots of stuff to do. So firstly, our data. The main data I'm going to use today is from the Survey of Workplace Arrangements and Attitudes. We call it SWAY. So it's a monthly repeated cross-sectional survey of 5,000 respondees. So we randomly sample US residents aged 20 to 64, and we reweight to match on education, age, gender, and region, the current population survey. So this is an online survey. So, these surveys have become pretty popular. They're used in a lot of polling and forecasting and market research. Basically, you pay people, we're paying people $2 per survey, and they have to answer a bunch of questions. And we do that once a month. I'm happy in Q&A to discuss this. It's not perfect. Obviously, we don't know exactly who we're interviewing them beyond the data they give us. It's probably not representative. We can reweight based on observables. It's harder to do that on unobservables. On the other hand, it's cheap. It's really fast. So Monday, you decide you want to do a survey. You post the survey out. By Wednesday, you have the data. And it's enabled us to do month by month of these surveys. And it's become very popular. So I'm happy to talk about it. As a research tool, a lot of people are doing these kind of online surveys. It's companies like Lucid, Question Pro, Prolific, etc., that offer this survey. So here is some information about the characteristics of our respondees. The black bars here are the shares of our raw data by age, gender, education, earnings, industry, census division, which is basically location. In red is what we get after we reweight it, and green is from the current population survey, which is a population representative survey in the US. You notice that our black bars aren't that different from the raw data anyway. We tend to be have slightly more women, slightly more younger people, and slightly more educated people. For some reason, in these online surveys, you find repeatedly that younger female educated people are more likely to respond. We reweight that, and we basically match the national distribution. You don't have to do much reweighting to do it. We're slightly overweight and higher earners, again, as part of the higher education. So what about the future of work from home? So, this is the data, it's chart I've already shown you, huge increase in work from home. So it's currently about 10x its pre-value. It's going to drop back to about 5x. So it's 5% before, it's roughly 50%, a bit less during, it's going to 25% after. So it's a 4 to 5-fold increase. Where's that coming from? Well, here's some data on organizations. I'm guessing most of your universities look like this. This is what Stanford University, for example, roughly looks like. I've spoken to, my local city council, a lot of hospitals, research labs, UN, World Bank, the civil service, so many firms, investors, etc., investment companies. This is pretty typical. So in a typical organization, take a university, take Stanford, just to be simple. Half of our employees work on site. So at a university, these are like security, janitors, catering, transportation, assistants, people that actually have to teach in classrooms. They are mostly, but not entirely, lower paid non-grads. I wouldn't include faculty that are fully on site. People that have been entirely on site during the pandemic are going to be entirely on site post-pandemic. That's about half of employees, and they're mostly lower paid non-grads. So half of Americans, probably a larger share in Brazil because the structure of the economy, are basically on site, cannot work from home, their jobs don't allow it, never will. The interesting question is the other half. So this other half are broken into two groups. There's a big group, which is probably everyone listening, mostly higher paid managers and professionals. They are typically going to hybrid 3-2, which means 3 days in the office, 2 days at home post-pandemic. So think of Apple. Apple announced post-pandemic, everyone's going to come into the office Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, work from home Wednesday, Friday. or Lazard's, the investment bank I'm working with a lot, they said everyone's going to come into the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, work from home Monday, Friday. Or JPAL, for example, the research institute, you'll know from the RCT stuff, everyone going to come into the JPAL office Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, work from home Thursday, Friday. So they're all versions of hybrid. They're kind of standard versions. That's 40% of people. And then the remaining 10% have been fully remote during the pandemic, are likely to remain fully remote. These are more specialized roles, things like IT support, HR, payroll, finance, some kind of technical jobs. These are the kind of jobs that you're not managing anyone, really not heavily, so you don't need to be there in person. And they're not typically like hugely creative. They're not researchers or coming up with new ideas. Think of IT support is really a kind of service role. It's a skilled role, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's a highly skilled role. So these are the three groups. And for Stanford, you know, these folks, it's so expensive to get some of these roles in the Bay Area around San Francisco where we're based. It's cheaper to have these people, say, based out in Oklahoma or in Mississippi, et cetera, and work with us that way. So why is hybrid dominating? Why are 40% of people in basically managers, professionals, the top parts of all companies, the top half roughly of companies, hybrid? Well, hybrid seems to be like the best of both worlds. So when you talk to companies over and over again, we see this to some extent in the research data. Working in the office has two big benefits. It's great for creativity. People say it's easier to be creative and work with people. I certainly feel it as a researcher working with people face to face. I find it, you know, it's easy to come up with new ideas over coffee, over lunch, and it's good for building culture. So when I go into the department, you know, I talk to my colleagues. You kind of, you know, you get the sense of more what Stanford's about. I know what's going on. A lot of it, to be honest, is chit chat about football. Whether Spurs, my team, is doing badly or well, people's kids' birthdays, holidays, but it certainly builds up, you know, kind of culture for companies and organizations. The benefits of working from home, well, one is it's quiet. So offices are actually pretty noisy, and it's easier to do quiet work, reading, writing, you know, preparing presentations at home. And the other is it saves on the commute. So the average American commutes about 1 hour a day, half an hour each way. So if you save them 2 hours a week of commuting, that by letting them work from home 2 days a week, that's a lot of time. In the survey data I show at the end, it appears that people, of the time they save on commuting, roughly half of it they spend working for their employer, and roughly half of it they take as leisure. So if you're a firm and you save an employee an hour a day commuting, they're likely to work about half an hour extra for you. So as a result, hybrids become dominating. You know, the typical structure for Apple, say, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, everyone comes in the office, you're organized, you have all your social events, your meetings, presentations, anything that requires face-to-face interaction is there. Wednesday, Friday is quiet times, individual preparation, reading, writing reports, doing data work, etc. So, you know, hybrid is dominant. His Citigroup announced it, Microsoft announced it, Deutsche Bank announced it, Google announced it, Amazon, you know, everyone has announced hybrid. I'm happy to pause. Naercio, I'm happy to pause if there are any questions at this point. Anyone have any questions? You're welcome to go off, unmute, before I talk about why it was stick and implications.
Yeah, I have a questions about those surveys. Have they been validated? I mean, have you did the predictions in the past and then actually waited for the future and see whether they match some of the predictions?
You know, I'll tell you an interesting story, and you can take it either way, but those surveys are now what's used in the US for political polling. On the one hand, you may think, well, the polling isn't great because it didn't quite predict how popular Trump was twice. If you look at polling data and you plot on the y-axis predicted vote share, and on the x by county, on the x-axis what actually came up, you get a very tight relationship. It's true that predicted Biden share was slightly lower than you predict, the whole line shifts down, but the R squared across geographies or by people is very tight. The reason that pollsters, political pollsters and market researchers moved online isn't, it's not so much it's great, it's pretty good, is that it's better than anything else. So what people used to do is stop people on the street or do random digit telephone dial or mail or email, but none of those they get worse response rates or more selection biases. So I would say it's kind of like a glass is half full. In terms of our stuff, it lines up with various other data. Like we have data on how many people occupy offices by swipe cards how many people swipe in and out, and that lines pretty highly with what we have, or Google mobility data from tracking cell phones, and that links up pretty well with what we have on working from home numbers. So, you know, we also had numbers on are you employed, and you compare that to unemployment and employment numbers, and that lines up pretty well. So it's reasonably aligned. It's not perfect. If you reweight waste, I think it's kind of the best option there is. I wouldn't say it's perfect. It's kind of 7 out of 10. I raise it in part for academics. It's not that cheap, but it's cheap enough. So if it's $2 a survey, it's actually a similar price in Brazil. We're about to do some surveys in Brazil with a big international company. You can
so
get.
You're pretty confident that those things will actually happen in next year or something. Those predictions.
Yeah. So the hybrid thing, I'm totally confident. So hybrid, just there are 3 different data sources I got. One is surveying individuals, people like me and you, they get paid to do these. A second is surveying firms. We don't pay them. I have a regular survey with the Atlanta Fed in the US and the Bank of England in the UK, and we collect large samples. And we ask firms, what have you told employees? The opposite direction, and that lines up very, very closely. They all say hybrid too. And then the third is I've probably spoken to 300-400 organizations, including some in Brazil. Actually, I spoke to a big real estate company in Brazil that invests in shopping centers and commercial property, but mostly through exec head, through consulting, through just talking to companies that reach out. And almost every company I've spoken to, bar 2, said they're going to hybrid. The 2 that were not going to hybrid are called Odesk and Automatic, and they're both going to remain fully remote. And they're 2 tech companies, so it's maybe not that surprising. But yeah, I'm very confident that post-pandemic hybrid, hybrid, the news is full of it, that companies going to hybrid. So that I think is pretty clear. I'll go to the stuff I'm showing today is reasonably confident about. The thing that's less obvious is what the impact will be long run. So what the impact will be on cities and inequality and transport and, you know, fertility. There's lots of things this is going to impact. And I think that's a really interesting open research question.
Okay.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks.
So you are asking people if they are going to be working from home full time or if they are going to be hybrid. I was thinking if this full-time working from home will be something sector specific or it will be more something of a firm specific thing.
Great. So very much a bit of both. As an economist, actually so there's a long literature, but so if you remember the Autor Levy-Murnane paper, which is about a task-based model of the labor market back from 2001, it's a great paper. I still teach it on my grad course. It talks about, you can think about what people do as tasks. And Brent Neiman and Jonathan Dingle had a much more recent version that said, look at occupations. What are the tasks they do? Can they be done remotely or not? So if you think of professors, our research can be done remotely. Honestly, undergrad teaching, I don't think can. Graduate teaching, maybe it's not great. It's pretty poor, but it's feasible in the short run. So you could break our activities down. And as professors, I think we honestly, if you're teaching large undergrad classes, it's truly awful remote. It's just terrible. If it's like 5-6 people in the grad class, it's doable because people have their screens on. But so for us, you'd say, look, 2/3 of our activities can be remote, 1/3 has to be in person. If you think of someone that works in, McDonald's, they're selling burgers, they can't do that remote. If you think of someone that's an IT or business support, they can do it. So what they did is they looked at individual tasks, and it turns out that aligns very much with the survey data. Come back to what Naercio is saying about with what people say they're going to do in terms of remote. So the stylized facts are certain industries, and particularly business services, think of finance and high tech, are very remote because there's people sitting at the computers all day. And those kind of occupations are very easy to do remote. They also tend to be very educated individuals. So there's an so people often think this varies by gender or age. It doesn't really actually. So men and women, young, medium, and old people all have very similar preferences and levels of working remotely. What massively shows variation is by education. So if you look at people that left school at less than 16, they're like 5% because they don't do the kind of jobs you can do remote. You just can't, if you're sweeping the road or working at McDonald's or working in a factory, you can't do that remote. If you go to people with PhDs or above, they're like 80% during the peak of the pandemic because they all do the kind of extreme office computer jobs you can do at home. And so, that education level is correlated with industries. So what you tend to see is industries with a lot of educated people like tech and finance have very high levels of remote working. industries like entertainment, travel, manufacturing, retail have much less educated employees on average and tend to have lower levels of remote working. They're also the same industries that got hit hardest in the pandemic. So these things all kind of go together. But Kim, does that answer your question, by the way?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for asking. I'll pause again after why it will stick. If anyone else has any other questions, I'll put them in chat. Naercio, I'm happy to be like interrupted. Otherwise, it will turn into a monologue, but I'll keep going.
Okay.
I'll pause again at the next section. If anyone has a question, let me know. So I think so I'll move this up here. Why will working from home stick? So we go through 6 reasons. 6 is a bit of a long list, but here we go. So one is what's called forced experimentation. Basically, I've been working from home for 20 years, and pre-pandemic, people thought it was just, to be rude, they thought it was crap. They were like so negative and so pessimistic about it, said it's never going to work. People are going to, watch TV all day or sleep or play computer games or goof off, whatever you want. And it turns out that that's just wrong. So he asked people, compared to your expectation before COVID, how has working from home turned out for you? And the huge majority of individuals and the huge majority of firms have said it's turned out way better than we thought. As in, people thought it would be, I was quite positive working from home. Thought, oh my God, it's going to be a disaster if the entire economy shifts to work from home. It turned out it was fine. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a lot better than we thought. So one is it's been way better than we thought. This is kind of like the one-arm, I could go through a detailed model of the one-arm bandit problem. You try bandits and, it's this old theoretical problem, but basically a lot of firms tried it. It works out better than they think, and it's going to stick, but the folks up at this end. Secondly, investment. There's been a lot of investments to enable work from home, tangible and intangible. So this is more intangible. How many hours, we ask people, do you invest in learning to work from home? The mean is 13 hours. You can think of that of getting used to Zoom, Teams, WebEx, whatever you use, setting up the office. Some of this is expenditure. I have a little mic. I bought a proper microphone. In fact, I have a little webcam because my laptop webcam was really awful. I bought a desk that goes up and down. You can see this thing is going to load because and I'm actually standing because it's easier to do that. The average American spent about $600. So collectively, this is about 1.25% of GDP if you cost these people's hours at their wage rate. Firms have also spent a lot of money. You can see that in national accounts on more hardware, software, and connectivity. So that's probably about 2 to 3% of GDP. And those are mostly sunk investments. So, they're made, they can't be reversed. So that's going to, of course, facilitate working from home. Thirdly is stigma. Stigma is, the fact that people thought working from home was a problem, and people that opted to work from home used to suffer in promotions. And we have lots of data on this pre-pandemic. The nickname was shirking from home, working from home. So I've been talking about working from home for a long time. I gave a talk at Microsoft. So to illustrate the stigma problem, I took a screenshot of Bing search. This was taken in March 2013. I typed in the words working from home under image search and just pressed go and screenshot. This is what comes up. This is what came up 9 years ago. And it's pretty terrible. It's like lots of cartoons, naked people. I mean, it's really negative. I was trying to think any positive. There's just not a single one of these is maybe this could be a positive image. All the rest of them are, this is positive, but mostly they're pretty negative. So if you look at it throws up similar search terms, working from home, funny, comics and underwear. I mean, this is all really negative. If you redo this Bing image search, I did it earlier this year, it's completely different. If you look at this, there's no cartoons, there's no naked people. Okay, sure, there are some people with kids, but generally most people look like they're working. It's positive. Look at the similar search terms, funny is still there, but desk opportunities, making money, etc. So it's totally changed. Working from home is seen much more positively. We collect survey data on this. You see the same thing. How have your perceptions, we asked the question, how have your perceptions about working from home changed amongst people which is shorthand for you, and it's dramatically improved. 3. 4 is, I'm going to illustrate it with things like this. So this is from the original 2013 PLOS paper by a research team from Japan, which is a paper called A New Methodology for Studying Dynamics of Aerosol Particles in Sneeze and Cough using a digital high-vision, high-speed video system. So I put this up because I doubt anyone had read this paper or heard about it before the pandemic. Suddenly this paper has become hugely important because we can show this kind of thing, that when people cough or sneeze, there's a vast spread of aerosol particles. It's made all of us, me included, I think, somewhat more nervous about crowded spaces, tight elevators, subway trains. We see this in survey responses. So this question, which of the following would best fit your views on social distancing post-pandemic? How would you return? You know, people here would completely return, substantially return, partially return, but they'd avoid, you know, and they'd not return, they'd claim they'd continue social distancing. You notice that, you know, a lot of people said then, you know, only 28% of people said they completely returned to pre-pandemic activities. The rest of people are nervous, at least of subways, elevators, and worse. That's going to make it hard. When you talk to firms, they're very aware of this. So if you're a big company, say you're Salesforce. So Salesforce owns Salesforce Tower, the tallest tower in San Francisco. It's a huge tower we can see whenever you're in San Francisco. Even before the pandemic, there were queues to get into the elevators, the lifts in the morning to go up, to come down in the evening because it was so jammed. And that's when people crushed in these elevators. Now there is no way you can have people crushed in elevators. And so because of this kind of concern, and so it makes it even harder to get people back into work. Fifth, what I'm going to call redirected technical change. So in a paper with Steve Davis and Yulia Zeskova, we scrape the newly applied for patents from the US Patent and Trademark Office for the share of them that mention words around working from home, like work from home, remote work, teleworking, etc. That's about 0.5% running up to the pandemic. And then it starts to rise and rise and rise. And of course, the reason is technology companies are fully aware that if the number of days work from home goes up 5-fold from pre to post pandemic, there is now a much bigger market to sell hardware and software to support that. So when I talk to companies, they're spending, you know, billions of dollars to get technologies accelerated and improved that support work from home, because there's a huge market now out there. You know, will it be virtual reality? Probably. What it will be is hard to tell, but it's certainly going to improve. And to highlight this, I've been working from home for almost 20 years. And even back in 2010, when I ran a randomized control trial out in China, things have changed a lot. So in particular, over the last 10 years, we've had video calls. So Zoom was only founded in 2011. And we've also had the cloud. So things like Dropbox means you can share files. And again, Dropbox was founded, I think, in 2009, and the cloud was 10, 11, etc. So even in the last 5 years, it's got a lot better with video calls. And we couldn't do what we're doing now without video call. Beforehand, it was telephone, and we can share files. Like I've just emailed you, everyone, this presentation. I couldn't do that. Couldn't have done that 6-7 years ago. So all I'm saying is it's hard to know how this will improve in future, but it's definitely going to get better. And even recently, it has already been getting better. It's just kind of, you know, it's easy to forget. And then finally, the labor market, at least in the US and UK, has become very strong. So strong that firms are now forced to basically offer work from home. It's the only way to stop people quitting. So here's this question. If my employer announced that all employees must return to the work site 5+ days a week, I would. You notice 56% of people say comply and return, but about 40% say they'd either return and look for another job or quit on the spot. So, you know, it's also the case that people like working from home at least 2-3 days a week so much that employers, in order to stop people quitting and finding another job, are being forced to adopt this. So I'll stop and happy to go to
yeah, hi, Nick. Sorry, could you go back like 2 slides, number 4, please? The one on the fear of, yeah, the fear of
You're
getting
not seeing, are you seeing my screen? You can't see my screen, I don't think, right now.
Yeah, now I think I can't. But anyway, it was about this slide that you showed, this fear of social proximity. But I saw that the answers were from the surveys taken like by mid 2020. Did it go down, this fear of getting close to other people?
So you mean, Gustavo, you mean looking at this?
Yeah, and then the answers are from the September, October 2020.
Yeah, okay. I was emailing my co-author Jose to ask him to update it. It's gone. I didn't quite make it. It's gone down a bit, but not that much. Surprising. I didn't, actually, it's interesting about this survey. I gave a talk at Princeton, this Marcus's Bendheim thing, and I actually asked, I polled the audience for them, which is basically economists. There are people like us, they're literally PhD economists, and they gave a very similar number. In the international survey across about 10 countries, we've got very similar numbers. So roughly speaking, a third, I don't know whether you can believe it. So one thing is these seem very high numbers. But imagine this. So right now, 2/3 of people say they'll be nervous about getting in crowded spaces. Imagine you halve that or even divide it into 2/3. You say, look, rather than 2/3 of people, maybe it's only 15, 20%. That's still enough to mean for companies, you can't crush people into elevators, you can't crush people into entryways, because even if 1 in 10 of your employees feels really uncomfortable, you can't do that as a firm. So I think the lesson I taught to companies is they cannot crush people into elevators, entryways, hallways post-pandemic. And so it's leading to a big reduction in office space. I don't know what's happening in Brazil, but in the US, if there's an elevator and it's like crowded, people are incredibly uncomfortable about it.
Yeah.
And it is influencing society. This thing may slowly wane. It's hard to know. If you look at 9/11, there's another good example. After 9/11, air travel dropped a lot in America, and it took 3 to 4 years to recover. So people eventually did forget about it. Who knows with the pandemic, given it's lasted 2 years? I mean, maybe in 10 years we'll forget about it, but I don't think for the next 2-3 years we're going to go back to the kind of high density. Like I used to take the tube. As Naercio remembers in London, London Underground was like crushed. Your face was like pushed against, the window. I just can't see, people are doing that to some extent, but a lot of people will feel uncomfortable about doing it.
Yeah, here I see a lot of restrictions in terms of elevators, like a maximum number of occupants and things like this. But I'm not going out too much, so I'm not the best person. I'm still working a lot from home.
Yeah, I mean, I still work, partly for convenience, I still work from home, but yeah, employers still have those stickers on the floor of elevators. Slowly, things will return. Interesting enough, I'll talk about offices a little bit. Interesting enough for offices, the big issue is not so much desks. It's not like just over me and you in the same office. I'm so worried about you sneezing on me from your desk 20 feet away. The problem is when we both go to the toilet or we both come in and out the entranceway. So that's where the space is. And that's a real problem. And one thing is office buildings, it's expensive to put more elevators in. So they're just, in the US, it looks like density in offices is being cut by about 20%, which is an enormous impact. If you think of city centers, you're stripping out 20% of commuters. Think of office real estate. There's a lot of big things that flow from it. Brenno, did you have a question?
No. Brenno, do you want to ask something?
Yes, something real quick. Nick, thank you so much for the presentation so far. It's great to hear. Just a question. I don't know if you inquire this in your interviews, in your surveys, but the companies are worried if the workers are located in the hometown of the headquarters, in the same city of the headquarters, or they don't matter about that. As long as they can be in the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, depending on the hybrid model, they don't care about that. There's any data, any information about that?
So I'll jump forward a slide and just show you this. So if you look at, just to answer you, so let's see, hide this. So here's a slide of, I'll explain in a minute why this is relevant. So this is, we get US Postal Service data in the US, so change of address. So there's 180 million households in America. When you permanently move, you tell the Postal Service, look, I'm changing address, please send my mail to here instead. And the US Postal Service actually online publishes this data by zip code. It's amazing data. Anyone can get it. It's not proprietary data, it's free. And so if you analyze it, what you see, hardly surprisingly, is in big cities, New York, San Francisco, the zip codes in the center have seen massive loss of residences, of individuals living there out to the suburbs. So what we see is if we look at this data, we get the flow data, only about 5% of these people have gone out to rural areas. The remaining 95% that have left have gone mainly out to the suburbs of the same city, some of them out to other smaller cities. So I think what's going on is the people that are working hybrid, mostly employers are not restricting where they live. And so they're moving out, rather than being half an hour from the office, they're moving out to an hour from the office because they only have to commute 3 times a week and they want a home office. But they're not typically moving to somewhere else because it's still really hard. I mean, if, say, San Francisco, if you move to Nevada, which offers lower tax rates, but it's a 5-hour commute, you just can't come in 3 days a week. So we do see some people move, 5% of people have left rural areas. That matches roughly the 10% of people that are going to go fully remote. So there seems to be a 2-track economy, or 3 tracks. There are people that are coming in face-to-face, they're not really moving. There are people, like probably everyone listening, that are professionals and managers, are going to go to hybrid, whereby you can move further out, but you have to be kind of close enough to come in 2-3 times a week. And there are people that are fully remote, and they really are moving anywhere. The only thing in the US that constrains people on where they fully move is tax law. So I don't want to get too complicated, but for Stanford University, they're unkeen to have anyone go out of state. California is an enormous state, so it's probably the size of, a third of, it's just a huge piece of land. And there's a lot of very low income, cheap areas in California. They want you to stay in state, because if Stanford has a lot of employees in other states, it has to file tax returns and other things in other states. But they may, in the long run, firms will get around that by outsourcing it. So, you set up an outsourcing company called Raise Consulting. And Stanford pays you, and you provide me with 50 employees. And then Stanford's not directly employing people in other states. You are, this is what's going to happen. You're going to outsource people. But so there's a lot of movement, but mostly people are moving still within commute distance. But that commute distance is now 2 hours rather than 1 hour.
Thank you so much for this.
I don't know,
Sorry, this is great.
Yeah, you should. This is a different paper. It's called a donut effect paper with Arjun Ramani. In here, the US Postal Service has amazing data. I've seen similar data for a lot of European cities. I bet, Sao Paulo, Rio. I don't know how much. I'm sure Brazilian cities, the very core financial districts, are probably emptied a bit, because the folks in San Francisco living here, you lived here because you have to go into work 5 days a week, and it's heavily dense and it takes time. Now, if you're only coming in twice a week, personally, a lot of people wouldn't live here. They'd live here. I mean, this is, you get a house rather than a small apartment and a backyard, and etc.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting.
Any other questions? Or I'm happy to go on, but just in case there are any other. Okay, no, so do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I'll go through implications. So I'll move this other way a bit. Here we go. So one is inequality. This is kind of a slightly odd concept of inequality. Just to explain what I mean. The first thing is working from home is a really valuable perk. Most people like it. They like it quite a lot. So I ask people this 2-part question. Are you positive, neutral, or negative on working from home 2 or 3 days a week versus full time? People that answer positive or negative, we give them this set of options. They can, to avoid giving them 15 options, we ask them, they're neutral, they just stay there. They're positive, they say how positive, and negative, how negative. This is the distribution. On average, people value working from home at about equivalent to a 7 or 8% pay increase. Turns out that matches almost exactly the numbers from Mass and Play's 2017 A article, where they use a randomized control trial. So 2 completely different methodologies, pre and post pandemic, come up with very similar numbers. So, there's obviously a spread, but I would say hybrid working is equivalent to most people, somewhere between 5 to 10% of a pay increase. In part because you can move further away, in part because it's nice, you don't have to commute, it's less stressful. So it's similar to like a pension plan, or in the US, a kind of mean healthcare plan. And the reason this is an issue potentially for inequality, more welfare inequality, is if you look, this is income levels pre-pandemic to rank people. Here's number of post-COVID days work from home. Black circles is what people want. Everyone basically, on average, by income level, wants 2.5 days a week. Here's what they say their employers are going to give them, and that's very steeply upward slope. So you can see folks on $20,000 a year want to work 2-3 days a week at home. Basically, not going to get much at all. Folks on $200,000 and $250,000 a year want to work 2-3 days a week from home. They're going to get pretty much that. So this is an issue, and I talk to companies, actually, this comes up a lot. They say, look, our frontline employees are really pissed off because they've had to spend the pandemic coming in every day, and they faced infection risk or got infected. It's hard work, it's unpleasant, they're in masks, and the managers and the head guys, they've got to work from home, are really angry. So it's not just a society thing. There's also kind of a big within institution inequality, and probably some of you have heard this too. I hear this a lot from firms, and they're like, how can we make these folks happier? Secondly, I mentioned this earlier about location. Here is New York, San Francisco. Here is across the 12 largest US cities. We call this the donut effect. So the idea is you can literally see the donut here. The center empties out and the suburbs get fatter. The center empties out, the suburbs get fatter. So this is this donut idea. You see on average across the 12 US cities, they've lost roughly 15% of residents by population flows. This data goes up, I think, to September. They've yet to come back, and I think Omicron's going to slow that down. So some of these obviously eventually come back, but not all of them. So I think long run, the city centers are going to have less people living in them because the price, it's not like no property is going to be empty. What's going to happen is apartment sizes will get a little bit bigger, price per square foot will fall, and other people will move in that were priced out. Maybe essential workers, like if you're in the US, if you're a firefighter or a teacher or a nurse, you have to go into work, or a janitor, you have to go into work every day. You may decide to move into the city center if the rents drop enough. So city center is never going to be empty. It's just going to be techies and bankers move out, and probably people that are lower earning actually move in. There's a big question for companies. What about headquarters? I don't hear any noise about headquarters moving out. So these are city center HQs, these, industrial parks. This is Dunder Mifflin from The Office. I don't hear many firms are saying, look, we're moving out of city centers. The reason is hybrid, the whole hybrid model, the idea, take Apple, is Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, everyone comes in. You're really social, you meet together, you have a lot of events, training, lunches, leaving dues, presentations. And therefore, to do that, everyone needs to come into the same location. And you don't particularly want to drive out to industrial parks with, spread around the edge of the city. So you want one common place everyone comes in. So I think individuals are going to move out. I don't see companies moving out much from city centers. Thirdly, this came up earlier on offices. We know there's about 30% less people, person days in offices. Where does that come from? Well, I mentioned at the beginning we're going to go from about 5 to 25% of days work from home. So that's a 20% reduction in person days on employer premises. Most of that is concentrated in offices because offices are heavily overweight in the kinds of graduates in tech and finance. So they're going to see about a 30% reduction. So then you may think, well, look, all of that reduction goes to less, space. Mostly no. So between 5 to 10% reduction in office space, mostly it's less density. And maybe at this point it's obvious why, but if you run an office, you've got two problems about reducing space. One is people really don't like density in offices, elevators, lifts. So you really probably have to reduce the number of people that work in your office. And secondly, everyone wants to work from home on Monday and Friday. So I thought maybe I had that slide, but everyone wants to work from home on Monday and Friday. And so if everyone's working from home Monday and Friday, you can't really reduce your office footprint. It's, a more extreme version of, we know offices are empty on Saturdays, Sundays, and throughout the night. We just accept it. So offices have become even less used with even more of a peak load problem on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So generally what I'm seeing is lower density, but not less office space. I am seeing offices are going to be redesigned. Same with university departments, I guess, a bit in the long run. So this is Mad Men, these kind of old style corridor offices, like, Naercio, remember, this is the kind of thing that we had in UCL and LSE. This kind of thing is, it looks like 1960s, 1970s, 1980s universities. It's kind of on its way out in offices. And the reason is, if you're only in the office 3 days a week, you want to be really social. So, Naercio and I are in the office. We shouldn't be sat in our, offices quietly working on their own. We should be in meetings, at client events, presentations, brainstormings, trainings, etc. So this is what offices are moving towards. Soundproof cubicles to allow people to use Zoom without shouting and making too much noise to disrupt everyone else. More meeting rooms, more open plan seating, particularly kind of lounge seating, so that when people come in and they're between meetings for half an hour, they just sit down, they open up their laptop, they work, but someone may see them and chat, etc. Productivity. Productivity looks like it's a moderate positive. I've run a randomized control trial that came out in the QJE on productivity from working from home a few years ago. I'm doing a second one now. In both cases, it looks like it's positive, but not huge. Here's survey data. We ask people, what's the impact on productivity? It's positive, but not huge. The main drivers of this is people say, look, if I have to do quiet work, it's more effective to do that at home. And B, I avoid commuting. And avoiding commuting means I spend some of that extra time working, and that makes me more productive, at least as they define it. 5 is time. So, you know, given that they save on commuting, what do they spend the time on? So during the pandemic, the average, you know, America has saved, I don't know how many hours Brazil has saved. Americans have saved about 60 million hours a day avoiding commuting. That's an enormous amount of time. So if people are working from home and not commuting, we ask people, what have you done with that time you've saved on commuting? You notice about half of it, they worked for their current job. And the other half is either leisure or what we call home production, like another, you know, looking after kids, home improvement, etc. But it's kind of interesting. There's an enormous dump of time onto, you know, Brazilians, Americans around the world. It's a great question of what they do with it. It looks like roughly half-half is split on their employer and on other activities. So I'll end. So, you know, working from home days, at least in the US, have gone from 5 to peak 60 down to about 20%, so 4 to 5x increase. My guess would be in Brazil, if you divided all these numbers by 2, that probably would be guessed as what I'd expect for Brazil, just because you know, have a higher ratio of agricultural manufacturing and less on kind of finance and tech that tends to lend itself to work from home, but the trends will be similar. You know, the mechanisms are going to be very common globally. And I think I put 4 implications here, there's many more. I think it's a fascinating topic to collect data on because it's going to change society, change politics, change so much stuff as we go forward. Happy to stop now and take any questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is on people decisions to work from home. I guess, have you run some regressions like covariates of this decision? Because, you know, people with kids, do they prefer to work at home? If like, and there's also like some gender stuff, if you're a woman or a man. So if you're a man and kids, maybe you want to go to work, or if you're a woman, you know, you may have to work from home.
Well,
and also, it depends on the traffic as well. If you live in Sao Paulo, you know, you would spend like 2 or 3 hours in traffic. So you would rather work from home. It's a huge increase in your time, and you can do other things. But if you live in a you know, small city, no big traffic, so you would rather go to work. So have a look at these different effects, and there's implications for this gender stuff as well.
Totally, I think it's a really interesting question. So going through stuff that's the easiest thing is commute time. So people with a long commute time are much keener to work from home. So that's hardly surprising. If you live a long way from the office, you really want to work from home. Age is kind of flat. So I thought, well, maybe I'm not sure what I did think, but age is pretty flat. So middle-aged people have the highest preference, but it's not a big variation. So it's a bit of a hump. So younger and older people want to work from home the least. I think the reason for that is having young children is a big driver to want to work from home, which is under the age of 12. Having children 12 to 18 seems to be negatively associated to work from home. No one wants to work, you know, be at home with their teenagers. People want to be at home with their cute little kids. On gender, there is no difference by gender for people without young children. So men and women are completely equal, except if you look at the cell of people that have children under the age of 12, and maybe surprisingly at college, as in university educated. So university educated people with young kids already want to, both men and women already want a higher number of days work from home, but that jump up is more for women than for men. So we don't, in our survey data, see an enormous, we see some variation in gender, but it's almost all driven by college educated women with children under the age of 12. Now that is not a large share of the labor market in the US. It's something like 20, 25%, but it's extremely important because it's a lot of kind of middle and senior managers. So for firms, that's a pretty critical group, you know, middle-aged, college-educated people. And then there's some variation by race, which is if you look by the race of self-reported race of respondees, Black and Asian people have, I think, report like 2.8, 2.7 days. Hispanic and then white respondents are lower. They're all pretty high. They're not that dissimilar. There's some variation. There are some variations on things that are slightly surprising. But the big one is definitely time to the office, having, you know, how far you commute. Do you have young children at home? And, you know, those two. And oh, by the way, the other one is maybe not surprising. Do you have good internet connection and add space? So if you ask people, how good's your internet connection? Do you have your own room at home? Those two are very highly predictive.
And also, another question would be, this would have implications for low-skill employment, not only on the, say, supply side, but also, people, when they commute to work, they have lunch in
Exactly
retail
right.
and stuff. And in Brazil, like the low-skill employment is declining, has declined a lot during COVID, but hasn't recovered still. And it might be associated with this lack of demand, like for food during the day and retail and small shopping and stuff. So this kind of employment, especially informal in Brazil, they might not come back even after the pandemic. So it would be another effect.
You're totally right. My guess is a lot of it shifts out to the suburbs, actually. It's hard to know. So the question is, how do people respond? If you're working from home 2 days a week and in the office 3 days a week, you probably don't eat out when you're at home. You probably don't get, you might. I mean, it may be, in the US, it's hard to know. In Brazil, I don't know, but, do people use DoorDash or Uber Eats and order in? Probably less than they used to eat out in the office. They probably spend the same amount on retail. Some of it will be nearby. So look, if I'm working from home 2 days a week and I want to get my wife or kids a birthday present, do I drive out? Probably I do it at home. So retail may boost in the suburbs. Yes, but I think there's a huge impact. There's definitely shifts. And one of the things we estimate in that paper is roughly a 10% reduction in retail expenditure in central New York because of exactly this effect. Mostly this will shift out to the suburbs. So, retail parks around the suburbs are probably doing really great. I don't know about you, but around here, it's like really hard to get restaurant booking out in the suburbs, even during the day, because there's so many people at home. Whereas the center of San Francisco is pretty quiet. So, I mean, you visually see it on the street.
But also people have learned that they can, order like iFood and this kind of stuff. And so they might not go out that much. I mean, in person to a restaurant where they need waiters and stuff, they just order from home. So this might have a long-term impact, even in suburbs and stuff.
Yeah. It's hard to know how much this will permanently change it, but I think it's like a fascinating question.
Okay, Gustavo Gonzaga.
It was very interesting presentation. Thanks, Nick. I was wondering about the length of the work week, the total length. It also depends a lot on which workers we're talking about, like high-skilled workers, as I saw in your presentation, the ones that are going to mostly work from home. But there's this sense that people are always working, or it's like a continuous work. They can be interrupted every time at night. They do work during the weekends much more than they used to do, and things like this. And there's a lot of regulation regarding the length of the work week in several places. So like in Germany, for instance, in the 1980s and 1990s, the Volkswagen week, that they had like a free day of week that the people would not work. Have you thought about how these things are going to change and what would be the effects of these regulations specifically?
Yeah, I know Portugal's had some regulation on this as well. Generally, so one stylized fact is Rafael Acidonis and co-authors used a vast amount of data from Microsoft Meetings and calendar data and showed that the working day had extended out a bit. It used to be very concentrated. People come in the mornings and afternoons, and then emails and messages would drop over lunchtime. She showed that is flattened out. So less people are taking lunch. They're starting earlier. They're particularly working later. Whether we need and that was during the pandemic. Whether we need regulation to deal with it is less obvious to me. I've been doing a big randomized controlled trial out in China, whereby we randomized people by even on odd birthdays, whether they worked hybrid, as in 2 days a week at home on Wednesday, Friday, or came in full time. These were engineers and coders in a software company. And you're correct, you do see folks working from home appear to do slightly more work on the weekends, but not much. It seems like what happens is, they are working more remotely on Wednesday, Fridays. They probably put a bit less hours in on their home day. You can imagine, on your days at home, you may use it as a chance to go to the dentist, or go pick your kids up from school or something, do something you couldn't normally do, but then you make up for it on other evenings and weekends. So I'm personally kind of against regulation, but so I don't know if you had anything. I'm a bit nervous.
I was just wondering, because in a lot of countries there's this kind of regulations, especially with regards to overtime hours.
Yeah.
So, you know, like if you work more than 40 hours a week in many countries, firms have to pay. So have to pay a premium, have to pay much more than the usual hour, the hourly wage. So, you know, I was wondering how these things are going to evolve later on, because it's going to be much more difficult to measure, you know, like this.
Yeah.
All these regulations will be very inefficient. I mean, I believe they already are, but I think there's going to be a lot of change in this respect as well.
No, I think the law there's going to be huge changes in law on this. I totally agree. Germany had regulations, Portugal's had regulations. The US, I mean, there's things, you're exactly right, minimum wage. So how do you measure hours is a tricky thing. There's also another issue on how you measure accidents. So I have like a swivelly chair. You can just about see the top of it here if I pick it up. So, you know, if I did something crazy, like decided to stand on my chair while I'm working and then fall over and break both my legs, can I, you know, sue Stanford and say that's a workplace accident? If I did it in the office, probably. If I did it, you know, there's a whole bunch of this kind of thing that's going to be fleshed out. For economists, it would be great because it would generate nice identification for people to, you know, run regressions on states that do and don't have this kind of regulation.
Okay, any more questions?
We're going to be very punctual, Naercio. We started on time. We're going to end on time. Hey,
Yeah,
so
that's perfect.
yeah, hey, well, thanks for it's fantastic catch up, and hopefully I'll see you in person. It'd be lovely to come out at some point.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Nick. Pleasure to have your talk here, and thanks for everyone that showed up, and Gustavo, and see you all guys later on. Bye.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
very much,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.